So we've had some interesting turns of events, haven't we, over the last couple of weeks, and some major upheaval moments have arrived in our reality. And in this video, I want to talk about the characterization of the decade that we're in, the 2020s, and the connections to this decade we're in to the decade of the 1960s, because we have, with the transits of Saturn and Jupiter, a direct link or a direct connection that brings us back in terms of the astrological symbol set to that period. What you look for when you have repeated transits is echoes. You have echoes of manifestation, you have recurrences of theme, because the planets are precisely in the same areas of the zodiac, configured to each other similarly. And so in this case, Jupiter and Saturn are in the same signs that they were, and these planets are very powerfully active in terms of changing the reality, because in the ancient model, these are the slowest moving planets. The two longest term cycle planets, they're called the great planets by some writers. They're often ascribed to these larger changes in reality, and so they've returned in our time to where they were in the 1960s, and we see resonances, complete resonances sometimes, direct and uncanny resonances. This is clearly for me inspired by the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who's not someone who I was too keyed into his world. It was hard to miss clips of the guy because he was all over social media. He was kind of a provocateur, someone who would go around and have these triggering conversations. I've learned more about him since his assassination. I've had to, because of how important this appears to be to everything that's happening right now. But I always viewed him as more of someone who was clickbait, right? It was like he would go around getting little clickbait conversations, and I kind of felt like he was more that in terms of his political speech. It was like, let's go to where the controversy is to get clicks and to get popularity. I since have learned that he had built out this massive grassroots organization, and that he was this quite important figure in the American right, and I would even say in more of the mainstream American right. I mean, he was embedded in with Trump and with mainstream political advocacy. I mean, this wasn't like a radical in the sense of we're not going to participate in the outlets of politics that are given to us by the structures of society. No, he was directly participating in those structures. So he's kind of a mainstream political organizer, is how I understand him now. And a quite important one, and a quite powerful one. It appears to be so powerful that he was targeted for political assassination. And so when I saw that news, my brother texted me, he's like, Charlie Kirk has been shot. And I went and I was like, oh no. And I kind of realized pretty quickly, hey, this is an important moment. This is one that people may remember where they were. But then it took me an hour or two or three to peel back and realize astrologically what was happening. And this is why I think the assassination of Charlie Kirk is even more important. It's because of confirmation in the astrology that tells us to lock in and key in here. But this video is only about the 1960s Jupiter and Saturn resonances. I'm gonna release a second video on this theme later about the eclipse activation with Kirk and the assassination. And the short summary of that video, it'll be out here probably over my next two videos. The October 2023 visible eclipse in America. There was two visible eclipses in America, October 2023 and April 2024. And those visible eclipses crisscrossed over Texas. A lot of you may remember that. The thing is, the ancient techniques give us precise timing as to when those effects arrive. I'm not going to say much more about it, but just to say that visible eclipse, the first one in October 2023, was in Libra, running right through Utah, where Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And Charlie Kirk had a Libra sun and a Libra moon, it appears. So it's already telling me and confirming that this is a major event, given this astrological confirmation. So just stay tuned with me here. We're going to look at the 1960s and talk about some of those themes and how they've repeated themselves to help us grapple with this kind of stuff. I mean, it's major stuff. It's triggering all over social media, left and right, every media outlet, every commentator. I mean, this is the zeitgeist, the aftermath of his assassination, and the processing and the fissure culturally and psychically in the American psychocultural, selfhood that this assassination has created. It's a fissure moment. It's okay. I'm S.J. Anderson, astrologer. Stay with me. We're diving in, breaking it all down. All right. So let's just... All right, so let's just come out and say, when you look at the ephemeris and you say, all right, 6 July 1965, you had Jupiter in Gemini squaring Saturn in Pisces on 6 July 1965. What happened in February 1965? A huge moment was the assassination of Malcolm X. And we know where we sit now, and you look back at that assassination, and that's a huge thing because Malcolm X is larger than life figure now. There's the film with Spike Lee and Denzel Washington, that Malcolm X. These figures, when they're assassinated, they immediately become something else. they take on a greater purpose for the psychocultural landscape because they don't live anymore. Kurt Cobain is the same, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, all dying young, and then they sort of live forever. One of my favorites, Elliott Smith, they sort of live forever in this idealized form. When you look at 1965, this Jupiter-Saturn square in the same signs that we had the Jupiter and Saturn square in last year, and you're saying, all right, now we get the resonance, because Malcolm X was not a politician, he was an organizer with the Nation of Islam, very popular in those worlds, and particularly with the youth, was very influential, started speaking out. Without going into the theories of why he may have been killed, there's certainly an idea that he changed his tune a little bit and became more of a threat because of how inclusive he became after visiting Mecca, and that some people theorize that's why he was targeted. But we know before that, he was interviewed, I think, major publications. He became this kind of other, this kind of threatening other in the media landscape, where people would say, here's Malcolm and here's radical ideas from the African American community. So he was well known and popularized as a kind of provocateur, similar to how Charlie Kirk has been very popular with the youth. This organization he had, what is it? USA something, Turning Point USA. He was a popular figure, but a polarizing figure, and had mainstream coverage and all of it. So there's some analogies with Malcolm X and Charlie Kirk, but it's more the astrological point of it's the square aspect. And by the way, in this video, I'm not talking about sign-based anything. I didn't layer that in because it just gets too complex to overlap it all. You don't need to do that to make the point. We can just look at these perfected aspects to layer in this higher level point, which is that there's resonances between these two cycles. But again, it is 6 July 1965. Malcolm X is assassinated in February 1965, so same year as that square. In our timeline, we've had 2 squares of Jupiter and Gemini to Saturn and Pisces, and those were one in August 2024 and one in December 2024. What happened last year? I feel like last year kicked off this season of what they're calling political violence with the Trump assassination event, whatever that ended up being. And there it was, right? That happens right as this square posture takes place. The same square posture that was extant right when Malcolm X is assassinated, political violence. So, one point in this video, the era of political violence that you're seeing everybody talk about on the news, we have the Saturn-Jupiter matching. As it locked in, we get it kicked off and triggered. And it's just one of those things as an astrologer, you're like, wow, another resonance, another cycle resonance, wow. And to me, what it does, it's like my channel, I feel like in the last several years, it's just a laundry list of proofs for using the Saturn-Jupiter cycle. Just repeated proofs of how this is one of the most important cycles for mundane astrology. Of course, I had a whole video here last year about the student protests. And just as these planets began locking into the same posture, you have massive protests, anti-war protests in the 1960s. The universities become a battleground, and that all repeated. It was just so wild to me to see it all repeat. Just as our variant here kicked in, it was the universities are a battleground over anti-war protests, and free speech became a front and central issue. So we've already got 2 proofs then that are pretty darn close and direct. And so I want to just trace a little bit with the rest of the time in this video of kind of where we're going. We've now just started the phase by sign of Saturn and Jupiter in a trine posture. The first time this cycle we're living through a Saturn-Jupiter dance, where they're now in a flowing trine, sign-based trine. They get very close, they don't perfect the trine. In November, they begin separating. Next year, we get, in our timeline, the first perfected trine aspect. That will be in August, when you have the fire trine. You'll get another perfected trine aspect, April 2027, and the third and final in July 2027. All 3 of those are fire trines, from Saturn and Aries, Jupiter and Leo. If you go back to the 1960s, it was also a triple pass trine. The first one, however, was Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn and Pisces. The second one was Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn and Pisces. And the third and final in that cycle was the fire trine that we get next year into 2027. And that was the Summer of Love fire trine, 25 July 1967. That was the perfected fire trine. And I've been identifying this for a few years now because it really does fit with the astrological symbol set. The fire element, both Aries and Leo, are celebrations of the self, passions and the ignited passions of the human power to have a consciousness and celebrate humanity and celebrate the power of life and identity and individuality and expression, right? And I think about Summer of Love as very much about that. Love itself is arguably a fire element phenomenon. Mars rules Aries, where you have this impassioned desire. And the sun, your consciousness is impassioned and desirous. Themes with the fire element of spiritual consciousness, expanding spiritual consciousness. Both Jupiter and the sun rule the fire element by triplicity. Those are 2 planets of spirituality. And more impassioned, kind of clarified, a root spirituality, you might say, that comes from that fiery inner light or source. And then we can lead with that or talk about it in the outer world or express with others about it. The summer of love being this kind of spiritual revolution, you might say, really does match the fire element and then the trine aspect of support with Jupiter and Saturn. Next year. Final trine. We've got 3 of those fire trines yet to arrive in our reality. I want to encourage everybody to, look at that period in the 1960s and how optimistic it was at times and how much hope people had with a lot of new, tools and technologies and information and new cultural flows. There was a lot to be excited and inspired by, and then celebrating with other like-minded people. And you might want to try to replicate some of those themes here, 2026, 2027, given that historical resonance is likely going to be accessible. And it's definitely accessible in the astrological symbol set and the astrological layer of the cycle work layer. All during this time, there's resistance to war. That's a theme of Saturn and Aries. Our timeline, we get Saturn and Aries until April 2028. But you had during Saturn and Aries in 1967, the MLK Beyond Vietnam speech, the moral vision expands to anti-war critique. I think that's going to continue. I mean, we're not into any kind of resolutory phase with either war, either the war in the Middle East or the war in Europe. There's no resolutory phase. We're in a static but building phase. And I think next year, I just think it's going to be the climax to probably at least one of those wars. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February, remember, the year of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction has always been when the events in Russia have their peak and climax. And so 2026, that's one of the main things to think about next year is what's going to happen with Russia. What is the peak and the big event that will happen in Russia? Of course, it probably relates to Ukraine, and Europe's preparing for war. You can just pull up the headlines. It's like France getting ready logistically, Germany getting ready logistically. They're building weapons factories. This isn't a de-escalation moment, it's an escalation moment. And so it really just makes you wonder about next year. But of course, when you have the war, there will be anti-war, because that's just what people are. They don't want to die, they don't want to fight. There's something innate in humanity, fire element again, where we don't want to kill each other. We see that there's a unethical or immoral component often to that. And that's why most religions have thou shalt not kill right there in the Decalogue, thou shalt not kill. And so love your neighbor as yourself. There's something innate, I think, and we're going to have to get in touch with this sense of the fire element in us. And what are our innate values and morals, and then how do we express those? But I do think the anti-war movements will continue. This whole time of political violence and of upheaval and of resisting wars and free speech and fighting for expression, and all of these themes from the 1960s appear here to become and continue to be major themes next year and into the year after. This is a high-level thing for the rest of this video. The main thing is we're in a season of political violence. The Saturn-Jupiter cycle confirms it. You had it kicking off with Saturn in Pisces, similar to how it kicked off in 1965 with that same posture. But when you go to later in the 60s, you have the assassination of RFK, MLK. So you continued to have seasons of political violence. And again, let me pause here. I don't want to predict this, all right? This isn't a video. We're going to have more political violence. I don't want any political violence. I want that to end today. My job as an astrologer is to map time. The purpose of this video is just to help us contextualize, one, the intensities of what we just saw here with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, how triggered everybody got in the fissure in our reality, one. Two, it would be dereliction of duty if I just said, okay, nothing ever is going to happen. I mean, we don't know what the future. I don't wish for it. No one knows it. But when you trace the timing of the 1960s, it does say we have to at least be not surprised if some of this stuff continues. The stuff we don't want, the stuff we wish for to not happen, the stuff that we hope never happens, all right? It's just we're prepared if the cycle is telling us there could be a season of this to continue, and we don't really get full into it maybe until, later. But let me just trace the 1960s. So you had the oppositions, and these oppositions, it was a quadruple pass. You had Taurus to Scorpio for every opposition except the final one in October 1971, an opposition from Gemini to Sagittarius. That opposition started on 30 December 1969, and it ends in October 71. So that's a large chunk of time as Saturn and Jupiter are opposing each other. The technique I like here, and this is one from Stephen Arroyo and Liz Green. They have a book you can get on Amazon. It's lectures around Saturn-Jupiter cycle, transcribed lectures into a book form. When I first was learning this, I just read that and they trace it all. Saturn-Jupiter is a 20-year cycle. You can divide it into two 10-year periods. You have the first 10 years, the conjunction to the opposition, and then the second 10 years from the opposition to the next conjunction. And when you divide time like that, it's quite uncanny how you can map it. So you have 1960 to 1971, 71 to 80-81. Those two chunks alone divide time. And so you have this kind of optimistic, hopeful 1960s, new technologies, color television, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, all of the peaks of culture, the hope and optimism, the spiritual, new ideas, this tumultuous time of political violence and anti-war movements and all of that. But that peaks then as you get into 70 and 71, or late 69, 70, 71. And that's the pin or the turning point into the new phase. And so I just want to talk about it. Some of the events that can characterize that time. And so you go to 69 and into 70 and 71. These are the kind of things you get. You get Manson murders. That's August 1969. You get Woodstock in August 69, and then you get the Altamont free concert in December 69. So right around the time of that opposition, the first one perfecting, that's when you get the Altamont free concert. That concert to me is very telling because there was a murder there, Hell's Angels involved in a murder, you can go read all about it, but people called that in the media the end of the 60s, the death of the 60s, the violent end of the hippie movement, that it culminates in this murder, and then the Manson murders are also part of the vibe at that time. People mark that as the end of this era of the optimistic, hopeful, idyllic 60s, rights movements and the rights that were won and the anti-war and all of this stuff. They say that's the marker, and that's as Saturn and Jupiter begin to oppose. And so it's very, very clear that when you then get into post-Saturn-Jupiter opposition, we shift into the decade of the 1970s. There's also Kent State shootings in May 1970, which was also a violent put down of the anti-war movement that really changed the vibe. And what you have after this, people talk about the 1970s, is disillusionment, fear and anger, conspiratorial and paranoia reigns. This is where you get people worried about surveillance and monitoring and the Nixon era and all of that. It becomes an era of paranoia, surveillance, disillusionment, and basically people saying, I just don't trust the system anymore. Whereas the 60s were more optimistic or more utopian visions. We're going to change the world. Then you have the Saturn Jupiter opposition, the violence, and then the disillusionment in the aftermath of that. Anti-war activism stayed underground. Underground militancy and state surveillance both intensify in the 1970s. These are with people like Weather Underground, maybe you might say a culture of peace and love, into a post-trust realism culture, punk, paranoid cinema, all those 70s masterpieces of, The Conversation, the Coppola film, 3 Days of the Condor. There's a bunch of films about kind of paranoid, conspiratorial, political ideas from that era that kind of typify this disillusioned phase. And we're not there yet. We might still be in a more optimistic wave. Maybe there's tech optimism right now. A lot of people are hopeful about AI. And so just to come back to our timeline, where we sit, that opposition phase that is 1969, 1970, 71, we do not get that until 22 December 2029, where you have our first opposition, which is Taurus into Scorpio, and we get 5 of them. The last 3 of them are Gemini to Sagittarius, and the last one is in 2031. And so I'm just gonna stop it there because that's the point of the video. You see it. It's trying to stay on top of the Saturn-Jupiter clock, stay on top of the Saturn-Jupiter echo, contextualize where we are now, process and understand an assassination of someone like Charlie Kirk as an echo and a resonance, and just to kind of get prepared psychically, undergird ourselves to get into what's here to come over the next few years. And I think for me at least, 2026 and 2027 can be quite optimistic and utopian and hopeful and stepping into what is possible, the vision of what is possible. That opposition phase at the end of the decade, yes, maybe there is something that's darker that emerges that shifts the vibe into more of a disillusioned era in the 2030s. But I don't think it has to be that. I mean, I think we can try to shift the vibe into something better, like even maybe more optimistic or more practical optimism or something that's more creative optimism or something. I mean, the 70s have a lot to like, particularly the cinema and the art and the music. I mean, there was ways to shift the vibe into art that can resonate and inspire the human spirit. I was just watching something about Apocalypse Now, that Charlie Sheen interview. But I mean, these are the types of art that was made in the 70s, where you have masterpieces, people really sacrificing and suffering for art, people prioritizing their creativity. Hopefully we get as much of that. But 2 final things as we close. The 6-Day War in 1967 in the Middle East is a huge moment, because that's the war where Israel expands borders. And even today, people are like, the pre-67 borders are the international legal, what is sanctioned by international law. You go back to pre-67 borders to get a legal container for that entity. We see in our timeline, all of this has exploded. You know, Israel, 6 countries it's bombing, or 5 or 6 or however many it is. Netanyahu says, I'm gonna have a greater Israel with new borders. So this idea of Israel and new borders in the Middle East is resonant. So I just want to throw that in here at the end. And then the money system, because in the early 1970s, Nixon took us off the gold standard, and that's when we get the money system we're in now, which is a money system untethered to gold, and it's just this pure digital fiat system. And so I'm wondering if that's some of what happens here. That will still be Uranus and Gemini in the early 2030s. Maybe that's part of the end of Uranus and Gemini, will be the real true new money system unleashes, which would mirror the Saturn-Jupiter cycle with Uranus, and that early 1970s moment where we get the true new money system in place. So those are just some other things on my radar here. As we map Saturn and Jupiter, we stay on top of the clock and we try to process reality with it, okay? Great to be with you today. Take care out there, more videos soon. I hope to do this other video about the detailing of the eclipse timing. So that's gonna be out on this channel soon. I think I'm gonna do a video about October, a little bit more granularly looking into October because of how important some of the sub-cycles are. So stay tuned for that. You can always subscribe here, like, all of that stuff. Patreon in the description. I got links to my channel down there on Patreon. A lot more videos there if you're interested. Take care out there. We're done with eclipse season the rest of September, so I wish you some settlement post-eclipse season. And yeah, peace. Take care. Bye-bye.